Okay, good evening, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started for this evening. This is Drake Larson with Practical Farmers of Iowa. This is my first Farminar, so please excuse any minor hiccups, but I think Rob and I should be able to get through this. To make sure you're in the right spot, tonight's Farminar is pesticide drift, response, and compensation. Rob's going to tell us a bit of his farm story, but first a little background. This is the Practical Farmers of Iowa Winter Farminar series, the third to last one of this winter series. The Farminars are very popular, and we get usually lots of online views or live views, but then also the Farminars are archived, and we have several of them that are many years old that still get pretty active viewership. Just a little bit about Practical Farmers of Iowa. For those of you that are attending but are not members or are not familiar with us, at Practical Farmers of Iowa, we believe that one of the best ways to solve on-farm challenges is for farmers to get together, share the knowledge of what they know about those problems, and then do research to try to help them answer the questions. We believe in diverse and independent farming and think that a diversity of farmers and enterprises on the landscape is the best way to have sustainable agriculture. Sustainable agriculture is going to be something that's economically and ecologically sustainable. On the whole, Practical Farmers is committed to family. We believe strongly in building community, and overall we unite our members through a celebration of wholesome food production. So I noticed recognize some of the names on the list, and so I know several of you attendees are members. But for those of you that are not, welcome to Practical Farmers of Iowa. Many of the resources that we have available are available to non-members as well. But if you like what we have to offer, we sure encourage you to join our organization. As you can see, it's a fairly reasonable price for a year membership. We have a whole library of on-farm research reports answering questions that our farmers have posed and conducted replicated randomized research in order to help solve those problems. One of the perks of membership is access to our online email listservs where you can pose questions to farmers, and it's one of our most popular features, and the things that folks report that they like the most about us is the access to various members through the listservs. So from our website, I'll bring up our upcoming events. The month is almost over, so there's not much left on this calendar. One thing I'll point out is this Friday, the 28th, is the last day to register for the Labor for Learning program, where you can get paid on-the-job training with farmers in your area. It's essentially like it says, labor for learning. You trade your time and learn from an experienced mentor. Tonight's Farminar is going to be an hour long, the presentation, or just under an hour. We'll end at 8 o'clock, and we'll try to leave 30 minutes at the end for questions and discussions. I know there's lots of people on the list that have stories and insight to share about this topic as well. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce Rob Fox of Genuine Faux Farms. They had a recent spray drift incident, and he's going to tell you his story and how they've now decided to pursue litigation. I'll try to share his presentation and okay, Rob.
Well, it looks like we're ready to go.
Feel free to take it away.
Nobody's hearing me at all? Are you hearing me? Okay, now can we hear me now? Looks like we're going okay. All right, just wanted to share a little bit about the farm to start out with, so you kind of have an idea of who you're hearing. And one of the ground rules I'd like to set to start is you should feel free to ask questions, and I will do my best to answer them. There we go. This is just a brief summary of what our farm is all about. We're a small farm. We're only 15 acres, and we focus primarily on vegetable production. We do sell vegetable plants in the spring, and we do have poultry. We raise chickens and ducks and turkeys, and we do most of our sales through a 120-member farm share CSA program. So most of our produce is sold through that program. We are a certified organic farm, and we believe very much in sustainable agricultural practices. And these are the things that make our farm go. We're very concerned about the environment on this farm. We do maintain a certified organic status, and we'll talk more about that later. We believe strongly in diversity on the farm. We feel like that's a big part of our insurance for this farm. If we don't have a diverse set of crops and diversity in nature on our farm, then we're going to have more problems with the next thing, which is being a resilient and consistent producing farm. Some of the other things you can kind of see as we go on down there, those are the things that we feel are important. And we'll just jump right into what all this is about. In 2012, you'll see some pictures of what actually happened on our farm. And this occurred on a Friday evening at about 6:50 p.m. and that's wonderfully inconvenient because there's no way you can call anybody at 6:50 p.m. and expect them to be in the office. What you can see here is, if you look very closely, see if I can get this to work. We've got a fence line right in here, and we've got an airplane. If you look at this, you can see the plume he's currently spraying as he flies over. And right down here, you'll see that's a building, a small portable building that we actually had turkeys in or around at that time. And then if you see on this one right here, he's flying over the trees that are on our property. And this harvest store is probably, my estimate's about 60 to 65 feet high. So you can get an idea of how high this plane was as he went over. And this gives you an idea of what our farm looks like. It's only 15 acres, and we're surrounded by corn and soybeans. And if you look at it on this side over here, this would be, that year would have been the soybeans, and over here would have been corn, and we've got a road down here on this side. And what we ended up doing here is we've got this line down the middle, the red line that you see here. That pretty much indicates the border where spray affected us, and everything to the east or to the right was not affected by the spray situation. And the little circle that you see down there is where I was located at the point right down there. That's where I was located at the point that I was actually hit physically by spray during this incident. And here are some of the things that were in the spray zone. I'm just going to make this fairly quick so we can get to what we did. Things that were in the spray zone, we had some peppers, eggplants, some different kinds of beans in the southwest plots. Our high tunnel was in the spray zone, and we only have one high tunnel, so of course that got hit. We had some beehives in the area that got sprayed. We had, at the time of the spraying, we actually had some of the towels we use for our produce, and the containers for our produce were out drying after we had cleaned them. We collect water after we clean things as well, and that got sprayed. So pretty much everything that was in this area, we had to deal with problems because of the spray. And then, of course, you have to figure you're going to have some problems with contamination, especially when you see a plane fly over with that much coming out of it. So we lost a number of crops. The eggs on the bottom left represent a large portion of what we ended up throwing away. All the produce you see on the bottom right, we also threw into the compost pile. And the top right picture is a little harder to see, but we ended up having to try and move our poultry off of the fields that were sprayed. And so we were trying to represent there how we're trying to slowly move them off that field and onto fields that were not sprayed. And so that's kind of the story of what happened to us as far as in pictures. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to tell you what we did, and then we'll give you some more detail as far as how we did some of those things. And as I go through this, if you have questions and you put them in the chat box, I'll try and pay attention to what's going over there, and I'll try and respond in one way or another. So here are the things that we did immediately upon having the spray event occur. At that point in time, we were carrying our digital camera around with us whenever we were doing work, because we had heard somebody say, well, one of the best things you can do is be ready to take pictures if there's a problem. So happily, the digital camera was out where I was located at that time, and I was able to begin taking pictures soon after I ended up getting hit with some spray. One of the earliest things we tried to do was roll down the high tunnel walls in hopes of trying to prevent drift from getting into the building. We did a lot of phone calling. The first call was to our farmer neighbor to see if he could get a hold of somebody. We did not know at this time who the cooperative was or who the spraying company was, so our first contact was to the farmer. Unfortunately, they were not available. We called some of the cooperatives that were known to contract for spraying in our area. Of course, nobody was in any of their offices at the time. We called the local airports to see if we could figure out who was flying, and after that we ended up calling the county sheriff. And the nice thing about the sheriff is, while he didn't really want to allow us to press a trespass situation here, he was willing to go to the airport and be there and wait for the flyer to land and find out who the flying company was for us. So that call did end up being quite fruitful for us. We made calls to the Pesticide Bureau, to our organic certifier, and left messages so that it was on record that we were attempting to contact them. And we also made a call to a doctor, because I had in fact just gotten sprayed with some unknown chemicals, and we were wondering, well, what should I be doing at this time? What I was informed I should do was obviously get the clothing off of me, which we did, and we had the foresight to put that into a plastic bag. And then I took an extremely long shower, because nobody could seem to tell me exactly how long was long enough. So I just stayed there until I felt like I was a prune, and then got myself out of the shower. We closed the house windows, and I have to admit we were so busy doing everything else that we didn't think of that one right away. And we made sure to record our weather conditions and record the actions we took. And the last thing that we did is we made sure to use our normal methods of talking to our CSA Farm shareholders and let them know what had happened. We felt like it was important, since they had invested in the farm, that they be in on what happened from the moment it happened. And so we made sure they knew right away. So that was our first day. It was a pretty crazy day. We were pretty unhappy, as you can probably guess, and pretty uncertain of where things were going to go. And I think that's pretty normal. And I think probably the worst part of it was knowing that a weekend was coming, and we weren't sure whether we were going to hear from anyone until Monday. And in fact, I will say this, the Pesticide Bureau was there right away on Monday so that they could take samples and take our report. We also took our own samples to send to a private lab. We took care of that about the same time. The nice thing is the Pesticide Bureau folks were willing to show us how to take samples, and we were able to do them properly. We continued to stay in contact with folks at the Sensitive Crops Directory, our organic certifier, and we did have a meeting with a cooperative representative. The co-op that contracted the sprayer sent an individual out to our farm and spoke with us on Saturday morning. So we did have a chance to speak with them and get information from them. We were able to identify the chemicals that were used. We could find the use labels for those chemicals. We spent an awful lot of time doing cleaning. All those things that you saw that were out there, if we wanted to ever use them again, had to be cleaned, cleaned, and cleaned again. Tammy had the foresight to contact the Federal Aviation Administration and see if we had any recourse through them. There was a visit to the doctor involved. I am a person who has asthma and had one of my first asthma attacks in years after this event. So we made sure to go see a doctor. And if this were to happen to somebody else, I'd recommend that pretty much anyone should at least visit a doctor if there are any symptoms that are different, just to make sure that things are okay. We decided not to use eggs or produce that were in the spray area until we were sure that they were going to be safe, so we stopped using any of that, and we also contacted ISU. They have a poultry toxicologist, and we hoped that they would be able to help us. I see Ben is asking what lab we used, and Ben, I'll get back to you on that because we actually have something coming up where we can talk about that, but I'm glad you're asking. Last thing that we did is we actually contacted our liability insurance representative, and that was an interesting thing to do as well. I see James has got a question about the Department of Ag forms to fill out, and James, I've got you covered on that as well. We'll cover that in a few slides, so I'm glad you're asking about that as well. As far as liability insurance representative is insured, we do carry liability insurance on the farm, as everybody who is doing vegetable crops should be doing, and they basically said, well, this is a dangerous situation for us, because if anybody gets sick on any of the things that we produced in the area they got sprayed, we would be the persons, our farm would be held liable for their illness. And that, that doesn't necessarily mean that if that does mean because we provided them with this produce, even if we asked them to sign that we could, that gives you some stance later on. I see that James is asking if the cooperative rep is the same as an extension agent, and James, no, that is not correct. The co-op is essentially, and they're the for securing the chemical contract with the contract with them and say, we want you to take care of the spraying. Whereas the Iowa State Extension individuals would have no specific connection to this. So they are a completely different entity. That's a very good question. Well, here's what we did in the first month, and I will say that there was a good deal of stress involved in this because we weren't always sure how things were going to come back. The first thing we did is we started moving the poultry off of the contaminated pasture. We had to get them out of the area that was sprayed, things that were carrying the pesticides and the fungicides that were sprayed on it. Our harvests and continued to pick from that area, and we recorded the harvests. Make sure that we had records that we were actually getting crops from those areas. If you'll recall, 2012 was extremely dry. It would be pretty easy for somebody to just point at us and say, you were looking for an to try and say somebody else should pay us for our feed. Keep the crops going, and we made sure to keep that record. We're in the sample. That's another good question. One of the main chemicals in there was a lorsban chemical, and there are a couple of others, and we'll actually have a sheet that read them, so that'll come up in a little while. That's a great question. agent, which is a fourth part of the carrier. So that's what was in the spray. Harvest, by the way. So none of that harvest was eaten. We didn't even eat any of it. All the eggs were thrown away. We cleaned equipment. Now here's one of the fun things about being certified organic, and part of your farm is not certified organic. You need to clean equipment if you use that in the non-organic section before you can use it in the organic section. And we were fully aware that once we were sprayed, that area was no longer certified organic. That's just the way it's going to be for 3 years. You lose the spray. So now we have to clean things. If you go out and use your tiller out in that area, then you're going to have to clean it. Are we all skipping around a lot? Okay, let me test something over here.
Hey Rob, there's a sync button. There is a sync button at the bottom of the presentation.
Okay, say that again. I only heard part of it.
Bring us all back together.
I'm not hearing Greg.
There's a sync button at the bottom of the presentation. See if that brings us back together.
All right, how's that working now? Testing again.
I can hear you now. Let's go ahead and see if it helped.
Okay. Well, if that happens again, Yep. Once again, folks, if it starts to do that, go ahead and say something, and we'll try and make it work again. So it was fading out, and I think we were talking about the certified organic and cleaning equipment. Is that right? Okay, good deal. All right, some of the other things that we did. We started talking to legal representatives at this time because it was fairly clear at this point that nobody was going to come to us and offer to compensate us. So we had to move forward on our own on some of these things. We had to find some alternative sources for the product we knew we were losing. So, for example, we weren't going to have any more sweet peppers. They were in the field, and we were pretty sure we wouldn't have them for a while. This is for our CSA members from certified organic growers. We were in close contact with our organic IDALS, the Stewardship, and in how we could remap the farm. Asking what was sprayed. Okay, let me tell you very briefly what was sprayed. In our southwest plots, we had sweet peppers, hot peppers, eggplants, green beans, dry beans. So all of those things. Anybody else having problems? All right, we're trying the sync again. Okay, we've tried the sync. Are we back on? Okay. So in any event, today we were talking about peppers and eggplants and green beans. High tunnel was being sprayed. So everything inside there was gone. And then, of course, that would include things like cucumbers and tomatoes. All right, we're still choppy. And for some reason, the chat box just disappeared. Okay, all kinds of strange things happening here. The chat box just moved and bopped around, so we'll just keep going for a while and see if we can get. Okay, here are some of the things that we hear. We ended up making the decision that all of the produce from that area we did not use any of the eggs for 6 weeks. We made sure that once we were done with the harvest in those fields, we cleaned them out of all vegetation and we watered them down heavily with an overhead water, knowing that that would help the chemicals to break down. The compost piles in the area were no longer going to be used, and we did not plant our fall crops in the high tunnel that we had scheduled. So a number of things changed for us. We were able to move the poultry back by late September. We selected a litigator, and of course we filed an intent to pursue litigation. So all of those things happened by the end of the year, and that kind of gives you an idea of what happened for us. All right, Drake, how sound is doing well, or if anybody's hearing me at all. All right, Drake, are we still moving?
I can hear you. You are still choppy, yes. And I shut off the chat box somehow, and I'm trying to figure out how to bring it back.
All right, I tried sync one more time. We're just going to keep going. The nice thing is I've got Tammy here, so she's able to try and see what she's hearing and kind of give me hand signals if things aren't working. So we have a little bit of help here on that. We're noticing that there is a significant delay in sound, so I actually hear it. So anyway, let me keep going on this a little bit, and we may do an awful lot of question and answer where I'll just fill in blanks where things just didn't make sense, and we'll just go from there. Here's some information we got from the cooperative, and this continues with the question that we had before about whether this was extension or what the cooperative was. The way to look at this is you've got the person who is the grower, supposedly responsible for the crop, and they typically will contract with the cooperative, which is essentially the customer for the spraying application. And then you will have an applicator, which will be either a ground spraying company or an aerial spraying company. Sometimes they'll do both, but usually it's just one or the other. And it's the cooperative that has the contract with the applicator. So in a way, the farmer has a little less connection with the applicator if they go through this system. And this is what happened to us, is the applicator was contracted through the cooperative, who had a contract with the grower to find the sprayer. And the net of this is the fact that the farmer doesn't necessarily know when the spraying is going to occur, nor do they necessarily know exactly which chemicals are going to be applied. That is often up to the cooperative and not to the farmer. The farmer simply says, I want you to take care of these particular pest problems or these fungus problems, and then they let the cooperative do that for them. What you'll see down in the second half of this is you're going to see that we've got down here a list of the chemicals that were applied by the cooperative or the applicator for the cooperative. And this is part of the sheet that the cooperative printed out and had as an agreement with the applicating company. So you'll see there was some Lorsban right here, Stratego, and we've got Sniper down here. Bifenthrin is the chemical for Sniper. Some of these I don't do a very good job of pronouncing, so you're just going to have to take a look at them. Stratego's here, and then Lorsban, Chloropyrophorus, I can't say it, so I'm just going to let you read it. In any event, it does everything from listing the chemicals to indicating the rates per acre, how many acres it's to be applied, and the volume that they use for this. So all of that is sitting right here. This item right here that says Superb, that's actually a binding agent. It's not necessarily an active chemical to control pests or to control fungus. It's a binding agent to get it to adhere. Agent, and you can use these numbers right here to try to figure out what the mixture levels were, so you can determine whether or not the mixture levels were according to use recommendations. You'll notice that they have a range of dates for when they're intending on applying the chemicals, and this is the actual date of application and the time period of application right here. And they do maintain the general observed weather patterns at that time, and that's going to be down here. And we got all this information from the cooperative. They were required to give it to us if we asked for it, and we received it. In addition to that, we also received a GPS for this, and they should give it to you. Or at least all aerial sprayers. The aerial sprayers are supposed to be supplied with the GPS that will turn on for each pass, showing where the application. Here, you'll notice here's our farm right here. Red kind of encroaches a wee bit onto our farm, and in fact you'll find even up here he's over the lot line, so this person was not where they were spraying. This in and of itself proves that not only did they drift, they actually applied over the line of where they were supposed to be. So in any event, we have this information. The information is required that they need to be collecting it, and we were given the information when we asked for it. One of the things that we did not get from them was the droplet size. That's one of the things I mentioned you can ask for, because they can alter the droplet size, and that can help with drift depending on what the weather conditions are. They did give us everything. Ground application data didn't apply here, so we didn't have to worry about that. Here's some more of the information people were asking about. The item right here. You'll notice that we have a website just underneath the name. This is an example of the front page for the Pesticide Bureau. You'll notice there's a phone number on this slide, so if you were in need of trying to reach the Pesticide Bureau, that would be the number you would call initially, or you can use the email address that you see here. I strongly recommend, if you have any kind of sensitive crops, I strongly recommend that you have this number somewhere easily accessible so you can make that call. I will say the Pesticide Bureau has a reputation for quick response to get out to a spray site and do their testing. The testers are professional and do a fine job of taking your story down. But let me say this, you do need to be ready to give your story and give it succinctly and as well as you can. So prepare yourself with what you're going to tell them and how you're going to tell them. Because the clearer you are, the easier it will be for them to help you. Another thing that I would strongly suggest is they will ask you what you suggest for test sites. Where should they take plant matter so that they can send it to the lab and have it tested? You need to
Bear with us, folks. We're trying to get Rob back here. Apologize for the delays. We've lost Rob, and we're trying to get him back. Hey, Rob, are you there? Oh, there and gone.
Nope.
All right, we're trying a different internet connection. How are we doing?
Yeah, I don't know how to do that either. But I can hear Rob talking now.
Okay, we seem to be here again, so we'll just keep working. Drake, can you kind of tell me where we started cutting off?
it's been intermittent, and I don't necessarily know that it's the same for everyone.
Yep, that's what I think we're having happen. Is everybody's internet's just a little different here. All right, so let's go back to this screen very quickly here, and let me talk about it just a little bit. And it looks like we've got the chat box up, so I might be able to see some questions again if people have them. So we'll go from there. All right, so
can you see the chat box?
Here we are. Well, there's one on the right. I don't know if it's active, but it's there. In any event, here we go. This is the spray map we got from the cooperative. And this is our farm down here, this little area. And the red area right here shows the spray pattern. This is essentially what the GPS tracked as this guy had the sprayer on. Every time the sprayer went on, then the GPS would record this, and this is part of the map we received. And you can see down here, it's clear that he had the sprayer on when he was over our property. In fact, he had the sprayer on when he was over somebody else's property up here. So this kind of gives you an idea of what you can learn and what the technology is that's available to us. All right, let's go to the Pesticide Bureau. This is an important thing, and I feel like it's a good idea to just talk about it one more time, even if you heard this before. The Pesticide Bureau is an important piece of the puzzle, and you'll notice that the address is right there. Go to that address, you can get to this page, and you'll notice there's a phone number and an email right here. That number right there, I would suggest you write it down, you have it in your pocket, or you program it into your cell phone. That way you have it available in case you do have a problem. Their response is typically extremely quick. They send somebody out as soon as they're able to do so, usually the next working day. And they're pretty good at what they do. You need to be ready to tell them your story. You need to get your facts straight. You need to be ready to make it very clear to them what happened so that they can help you to the best of your ability. If you just kind of, well, I don't know, something happened and this guy sprayed and I smelled something, that isn't necessarily going to help them. You need to tell them exactly what you observed, when it happened, what you know about the weather. If you have pictures, share them with them. And the more informed you sound, the better off they're going to be with helping you. One of the things that we did right, even though we didn't necessarily know it, is we threw my clothing in a plastic bag, which they took with them. And were able to get tests and got positive tests off of that clothing. So that's something that you need to consider. And one of the nice things is we were given some gloves for sampling and some bags for sampling and instruction on how to take proper samples. And that was a really important part of what ended up happening for us. So if you need a little bit of help, these are good people to go to. Ask questions. Don't be shy. Make sure you talk to them and ask if you're curious about something. One of the things that's also on the IDALS website is the Sensitive Crops Directory. You'll notice that it is a long address down here, and of course it just rolls over a little bit. You can get there by going to the IDALS website and going to the Horticulture and Farmers Market page, and then there's a link to the Sensitive Crops Directory. You can sign up now, and I would strongly suggest you do so. I would also suggest that you check your status to make sure that everything is the way you expect it to be prior to each part of the season. One of the other things that we often do is we take advantage of that no spray sign offer. You'll see it down towards the bottom. You want to do that, and you have to renew this every single year. Make sure you renew it. And then one of the things that we do every year as well is we print a hard copy, and you will notice with that hard copy, that should be right here, I do a screen capture of this, and then I print it, so I have both a file and I have a hard copy in file. And if you look at this thing, you'll notice right down here it's got the date of when I last updated it. So what's important here, of course, is you print this with the date where you last updated it, so it's prior to the point that there might be spray. so that they can't look at it and say, well, by golly, you changed this or added this after we sprayed you. So another thing you want to make sure you do not do is you don't make an immediate change right after a spraying event and then print it, because now you no longer have evidence easily available that you had this entered before they actually sprayed. You'll notice that there are multiple 5 different categories right here that you can register with the Sensitive Crops Directory. You should register for every single one of these that applied. So in our case, we're under orchard because we do have some young fruit trees, organic, fruit and vegetables, and then we did have some hives on the farm, so we were also registered under honey. And you register your site for every one of them that applies, and you will get a screen or a print of something that looks like what you see on this page right now. One of the things that they ask for on the Sensitive Crops Directory is they ask for your latitude and longitude. And one of the easier tools I found to find latitude and longitude was this one right here, the GPS visualizer. Here's the address. And all you have to do is type in your street address and select the map. I found that Google Maps tends to work best for most Iowa sites. So that works pretty good. And then it'll come back with your specific latitude and longitude for the address you give. With Google Maps, you can actually select parts of the farm. You can select the 4 corners, for example, and choose those to show up there. But whatever the case may be, this is how you will find your coordinates for this. Hooray, it looks like the chat's up. So if people have questions or if there's something that isn't clear to you, you can feel free to use that, and I'll do my best to answer as we go. One of the things that we found helped us with this situation is we had a couple of beehives on the farm, and they were there for pollination services. And the person who maintained them was going to be collecting honey from them, of course. And one of the things that happens when you have bees on the farm is that you actually have some extra rules right here that might work for you a little bit. For example, one of the things that's required is there are actually times that they cannot spray within a mile of a location that has an apiary or a place where there are beehives. And so kind of what that does from my perspective as a farmer and a person who's worried about overspray and drift is, one, it means that the window of time that they should be applying is actually smaller. And two, it seems to me like both vineyards and apiaries have a little bit more pull when it comes to getting chemical applicators to pay attention. So if you can, that's not a bad thing. All right, yeah, I see that James has a question about certifying organic and will it take 3 years, and Tammy has answered that for the most part. Essentially what happened with our certified organic status is the entire west side of the farm became non-organic or placed back into transition the moment it was sprayed. So the entire west half is currently in transition for organic. What that means is everything we do is still using certified organic practices and inputs. Everything we do would be the same with certain exceptions. We have to clean equipment between uses on the west half and the east half. We can't pick produce from the west half and the east half and let them commingle. They can't be touching each other. They have to be in separate containers. If you use containers to pick in the west, they have to be cleaned before they get picked into in the east. And then it will be July 27, 2015, as long as nothing else happens, the west part of the farm will rejoin the east part of the farm as certified organic. So, James, you're entirely correct. It's 3 years that we do not have organic certification for that part of the farm. This is a part that became a very valuable thing for us, and I'm hoping this will be valuable for other folks as well. The Pesticide Bureau was one thing, the Sensitive Crops Directory is another thing, but there is a way for you to find out who this person and what company this is that this sprayer is. There's a spot right back here on the tail, and I have put a circle there on purpose because I don't want to. We are in the process of litigation, so I can't bring anybody's specific information up, so I've covered up his number. But there's an N number location on this part of the plane, and you can go to this site at the FAA and enter that N number, and when you hit the submit button, it will tell you who the company is that is in charge of that plane and their contact information. So you can find out who the sprayer is affiliated with by just getting that N number and going to this website, entering the N number, and away you go. We found an easy way to collect the N number was to have that digital camera out there and take lots of shots. The advantage of digital cameras is you don't have to develop the film. So take lots of shots, and one of those you're going to be able to blow up and get the N number if you can't manage to catch it otherwise. Contacting the FAA is something that we did, and if you look down on the bottom left, you notice I've got the website there. For situations like this, they ask you to contact the regional, or in this case it would have been the Iowa contact for the FAA, and they will take your complaint and they will lead you through the process, and you need to be stubborn. You need to make sure you stay at them. They'll be friendly enough about it and they'll work with you, but you can't just kind of expect they're going to do it without you continuing to go after them. Here's some things about the FAA that you might want to know. Very much the burden of proof is on you. They're not going to do things for you. You need to get things to them. You need to offer them a copy of your sensitive crops directory so that they can see that that happened. You need to give them pictures. You need to feed it to them. The regulations that exist for flyers, there are lots of exceptions for aerial sprayers, all the exceptions about distance from the ground, distance from buildings, they're all waived in the process of application. And so you have to be aware of that. So the one thing that really gets their goat, though, is if there's people visibly in the spray zone, then you can expect the FAA will do something. But if they do, you're not going to know it unless you use the Freedom of Information Act to find out whether there were any results. So you're going to have to do those things. So we had a question about what lab did we use, and we decided to use a private lab because the Pesticide Bureau, their results will take 2 to 3 months to come back. And if you're thinking you want to find out if your produce is clean enough to distribute, 2 to 3 months isn't going to work. And that's really that's not what the Pesticide Bureau is there for. So if you want to find out if things are clean, you're going to have to go to your own private lab. And you'll find that we used the Columbia Laboratories folks out here in Oregon. That was the company we used. And you're going to need to know what you're testing for. These companies won't just do a general test and then divulge or figure out what they are. You need to go to the sprayers and find out what was applied. And then when you send and apply your samples to these folks, you need to tell them what you want tested. So you need to give them the list of chemicals that were applied. Not every one of these labs can test for every chemical that might have been applied. So we actually contacted 4 of them, and this was the place that was able to do the 3 chemicals that were applied on our farm. The downside is private testing does cost money. It cost us $1,600 to do the tests on our farm, and that was significant for us. I mean, it may not be for a larger farm, but that was a fairly significant cost, but we needed to know. And they got the results back to us in 2 weeks. Here's an example of the test results. James is asking, is it the same to lodge a complaint of pesticide drift to the Department of Ag within 30 days? James, I'm not entirely sure what the length is. All I can say is that the sooner you do it, the better. Because if you lodge the complaint, okay, Drake says it's 60. But all I can say is if you don't lodge that complaint right away, then any evidence you might possibly get is likely going to break down to the point that they're just going to come back with a finding that there were no findings. So you want to move on this fairly quickly. Here's an example of our lab results, and here are the chemicals that they were testing for, and here are the results. They will label them as milligrams per kilogram, which is essentially parts per million. And so you're going to see things that say parts per million, and this is essentially the same thing right here. And each sample is going to get its own report, so we had several reports. This is just one of them. And one of the things that was most valuable here is we asked for a consultation with the lab so that they could talk to us and tell us what we were seeing. And keep asking questions of these folks until you're satisfied you fully understand what they are saying. If you don't understand, then these tests do not help you. Essentially what our consultation came out was, oh my, you must have been directly hit with spray. And, well, I have pictures that show that too, so I already knew that. But it's an interesting confirmation to have an impartial lab tester say this looks like you got directly hit. So at least we know things were consistent. All right, the EPA has all kinds of fact sheets out there on different chemicals. And you can go here and you choose chemical search and you can enter the chemical name. And if you do all that, you get to things like this right here. This will show you the tolerance levels that you might find for this particular chemical on these particular horticultural crops. And these are the allowed parts per million as residual parts per million on these particular things that are acceptable for consumption. So if you're curious, you can get these numbers from this particular place. The next thing that I need to mention is finding the use labels for the chemicals that were used. And you will find those use labels on this site by going to the company that manufactures it. And if you remember the sheet that I received from the cooperative, that sheet told me what the manufacturer of the chemical was, so I can go there and then I can choose the chemical and it will show me things like this. I didn't say this was easy, it's just what it is. So you will get material safety data sheets possibly, they're usually PDF files, and it'll give you essentially all the different things that you shouldn't do with it, if that's one way to look at it. There are going to be different kinds of labels. You've got the material safety data sheet. The specimen label, in my mind, ended up being the most useful one because it included setback levels for vegetables and how long you should stay out of the spray area. The least useful was the product bulletins because they're usually just new announcements that need to be changed. Here are the parts that I found most useful. One of them is restricted entry interval. This part right here tells you if you apply this chemical on this crop, then for 24 hours and 3 days for cauliflower, you're supposed to make sure that your workers don't go out into that area. And there's often an all-purpose restricted entry interval that just says, in general, don't let anybody out in the spray area for 48 hours or some other number like that. In other words, what I'm trying to say here is you should be advised if there is a spray situation that you should leave the area. If you're in a spray area, you shouldn't be there for the period of time that is the REI, or restricted entry interval. You shouldn't be in that area. The creators of these chemicals on their labels say that this is what you should be doing. And then down here, the other thing is specific use restrictions, and these are pre-harvest intervals. How long should it be until you can harvest a particular crop that has this chemical applied to it? So, for example, for the brassicas, for this particular chemical I looked up, it's going to be 21 days before harvest that you can apply, and it is supposedly safe for use after those 21 days. So those are two pieces of information you probably should look for. How are we doing so far? Anybody have questions on any of that? That was a load of information, real quick. I'll let you type for a little bit. I'm going to continue on this, but I'm watching the chat box in case there are questions, so I am paying some attention. Well, here's the deal. We're not a commodity crop farm, so we don't have corn, we don't have soybeans, we don't have wheat, we have peppers and beans and eggplants. So now what are we going to do? So some of what we did, if you'll notice in the picture right here, we're doing some weighing and we're taking photos to show that we were harvesting these things and that we had healthy crops. So we did an awful lot of that. We also made sure we had pictures showing that the crops were in the field, that the plants were healthy, that we were irrigating and taking care of business. In other words, we were making sure that we had been doing our best to have a good crop. What we have here is some samples of some of our pictures, but also what we did is we did not spend our time harvesting every single eggplant or every single pepper. What we did is we selected certain lengths of each type of pepper or each type of eggplant or each type of green bean, and we harvested those as close to normal as we might have if there hadn't been a spray situation. And then we took pictures, we recorded weights, and we let them all go through their cycles so we could get fairly accurate numbers as to what these 15 feet of green beans were doing this year. And then we could say, well, we actually had 200 feet of this green bean, and you can extrapolate from there what the harvest probably would have been. Then you can compare it with your prior records or maybe later records if the litigation takes a while, and show that this was within a normal range of crop production. One of the things I would like to warn people about is I did go out to harvest a couple days after the spraying event. I think it was maybe 3 or 4 days after, because we had things out there that were ready to be picked, and I actually had more problems with breathing after doing that. So there is still the possibility that maybe health should come first before you start picking and harvesting and cleaning things up. So consider that as you're doing this. We decided to condemn our crops when we got our test results back from the independent lab, because the numbers were extremely high, and it was a matter of liability. There was really no way we could say that this produce was safe, and if anybody had gotten ill by giving them this produce, we would have been held liable. Plus, it just isn't the right thing to do. We were not going to give people food we didn't think was safe. So we chose to not give them a chance to even have them. Our insurance representative very unhappily suggested, well, if you really want to let people have a chance at it, you can have them sign a hold harmless agreement, but they really didn't think it would protect us at all. So the net result is it was better to just say this is not going to be eaten, and that's just the way it was going to be. We continue to keep our customers informed without overburdening them. They pay us to live the experience of being farmers and to be their personal farmers, but they do not necessarily want to hear sadness continuously from us. At the same time, we had to be honest, and we had to keep them informed and give them the facts and clarify what was going on. So one of our processes is we would give our CSA members weekly emails, as we always had, telling them what was going on, and we'd keep them up to date because they were concerned and they did want to know what was happening. And we also maintain a blog where we would share more details that way. And in general, people were very pleased to be kept in the loop, as long as we also maintained some balance with other parts of the farm and we weren't gloomy Gus's all the time. So that worked pretty well. The livestock is a completely different matter. We had poultry. We don't have other livestock on the farm. We do have some farm cats, if you want to call them livestock. All these labels that I showed you earlier have grazing setbacks and they have forage setbacks, meaning that for example, one of them said for 30 days you should not have livestock grazing the area that has been sprayed, and for 45 days you should not cut that area for forage to be eaten by those critters. So essentially what that means is we needed to get the poultry off of the area that had been sprayed. All of these labels listed possible acute symptoms for poultry. Now, acute sounds scary, but all it means in this case is short-term symptoms of some sort of a problem. The more dangerous one would be chronic, which means that they would have a continuous health problem as a result of the spraying. So as they are removed from the situation, their bodies will eventually flush out the chemicals. None of the labels indicated, however, how long it would take for various livestock to flush these toxins out, which is why we contacted the Iowa State University and got some help from them on this. So here are the things we did with the livestock. We got the poultry off the sprayed area. Once the forage setback period was done, we moved them back onto their pastures where they were supposed to be. We cleaned all their waterers. We cleaned all their feeders. We did the ISU thing, and we monitored the health and recorded it. For example, we did notice at least one of our cats was doing very poorly after this, and we lost a few birds, but we could not prove, unless we wanted to spend a lot of money, that it was a direct result of the spray. Kieran's asking if these chemicals are known to cause cancer or other adverse health effects. The answer to that question is most of the adverse health effects for the chemicals that were sprayed were listed as acute health effects. For example, anybody who was exposed to it is more likely to have sunburn problems soon afterwards, skin sensitivity. There could be breathing issues, which I ended up having some problems with. There could be some eyesight or headaches or any number of things that could go with it, but most of the symptoms listed were acute symptoms with limited exposure. Now, to answer the question the rest of the way, Kieran, some of these chemicals have long-term exposure, chronic symptoms if you were exposed to them over and over and continuously. And I do not know off the top of my head if any of them is a carcinogen or causes cancer. But they do have some chronic effects with continued exposure. That's a good question. Last thing I want to talk about briefly is we did show effort to try and mitigate our losses or lessen our losses. And all I'm going to say about this is one thing. You're not going to get compensation if you're in a situation where you say, oops, we got sprayed, and then you sit on your rear end and do nothing, waiting for somebody to write you a check. You have to show that you're continuing to do work, and you're trying to make things go. And if you don't show that, then you're less likely to have any cooperation in the process. So you need to make sure that you're trying to, you show you're trying to make things happen, and you're trying to adjust. Here's a list of things that we already did and more things that we've adjusted since this to try and prevent drift, and I'll go through these very, very quickly. We're trying to add height to the buffer zones. In other words, we're putting some bushes in so that we can try and catch more drift with plants that have nothing to do with our crops. We're putting up more signs than we had before. All the co-ops in the area, every single one of them and all the landowners get letters from us every spring, and we want to emphasize you need to keep it professional in tone, but you need to make it clear this is an economic thing. You are a business and you are trying to make money here, and if they don't pay attention to that you're there, then they're going to harm your business. If you can make phone call follow-ups, that's good. Flag down the ground applicators to remind them that you're there if they're spraying and you're a little bit nervous about the wind direction. Do the sensitive crop directory, digital cameras, have phone numbers nearby. All those things on there are important, but most importantly of all, if there's a problem, don't ignore it, because it's not going to make things better if people say, well, I'll pretend I didn't see that. You need to do something about it. I see that James is asking if I grow fruit crops, and we do in fact have some younger apple trees that started producing last year, and we have a few other fruit crops as well, so we are listed as an orchard. And I also see that there's a mention of the Pesticide Action Network, which is, I do love what Pan is doing, so make sure that you take a note of that link that is down there in the chat box. That could be of use to all of you. Do you have any other questions for me? I'm willing to take them. All right, Rita, I see that you're wondering if we got compensated, and the answer to that question in short is not yet. We're still in the process of litigation, which is why I made sure there weren't specifics as to who did the spraying, and I obliterated some of the specific data. So we're still in process, and it will probably be 2 years out before we see compensation. How was my experience finding a lawyer? That's a really good question, actually. We were trying to find somebody who was in our area that was important to us. We wanted to have somebody who was nearby. And several of the lawyers were more interested in if it was a larger farm that might have a bigger payout, they might have been interested, but didn't seem too interested in our smaller farm. So really, it was more a matter of finding somebody who was willing. In this case, he was willing to do this, and he would only take fees if we actually were compensated, so he will take a percentage. So it was mostly a matter of finding somebody who was first willing to talk to us on our scale, and from there, things went pretty well. All right, I've got 2 questions here. I'm going to start with James's about the boundary between our farm and neighboring farms. In our case, we only have our own buffer zone that we have created. In some ways, I find that a little ludicrous because we're the 15-acre farm surrounded by the larger farms, so our space is probably a little harder to give up for buffers, but there's no regulation that they have to put a buffer around us. So we have a buffer zone that has it's grass in some areas. In other areas, we've got bushes of varying levels of maturity. And that's a matter sometimes of having enough time and money and resources to put the bushes in and get them to grow up and become a little bit of a blocking area to catch drift. Otherwise, pretty much right up to the fence line is where our neighbors will grow. In fact, a fence is important because that prevents them from continuing to cut out a little bit more of the land next to us and get a little close to us as we go. Kieran's asking about other unexpected implications of the spray. That's a really good question, and I'll give you one thing while somebody else is typing. We have a lot of trouble when airplanes fly over now. Both of us are extremely nervous when an airplane, whether it's a spray plane or not, flies over. We're looking around trying to figure out where it is. Another thing that we did last year that we haven't done in the past is we actually asked for volunteers to come out to the farm when we had to go make deliveries, so that the farm was never left by itself, because one of our fears is we'll be gone, somebody will spray, it will drift on an area and we won't know about it. So we actually had volunteers come out and watch the farm with a digital camera in hand in case somebody sprayed and crossed the line. All right, Drake is asking if there's any particular information that I should not be sharing. I did contact Tom, our lawyer, and he did say that I needed to make sure not to be making any specific mention of any of the parties involved other than ourselves. So even, any mention of who the neighbor is, any mention of any of the companies, I covered up the N number. I basically was as cautious about anything along those lines as I could. The other thing you probably noticed I stayed away from was any dollar amounts, and that was also on purpose. And while we're waiting for another question, part of the reason for the dollar amounts being left out is anything I say here is public record. And if I say something to the effect of, oh, I'd be happy with X number of dollars, then I could be held to that, or there could be other things, you know, it could be used to my detriment. So we have to be careful with what we're saying. And while people are typing, you'll notice the picture of the cat. That's Sandman, one of our cats on the farm. We got this wonderful picture of him with that stink face, and we've decided we like to use him every once in a while and put him out there. He's our spokes cat, so we'll leave him out there. There we go. Now we've got some questions. I'm probably going to do these in a slightly different order. Sam is mentioning the air sampler provided by PAN, which is a good thing. We've actually applied to do this coming season, and hopefully we'll get to do that. And yes, one of the things that we have noticed on the farm is that frequently there will be ground application on days that have far greater winds than are recommended by the use labels. Most of the use labels will say very specifically what the wind levels should be for application. But with the current system of spraying that we have, with a limited number of applicators, they often work awfully hard to get a lot of spraying in on days when they shouldn't be spraying at all. James is mentioning something about the food safety plan for good ag practices. And we do, in fact, have a number of practices that we follow for GAP. And frankly, a lot of those, you know, they're mostly common sense as far as they're concerned. And a lot of them end up taken to the next level when you are certified organic and you end up having half of your farm in transition. It actually gets put to a bit more of a test. And Drake is asking relationships with our farming neighbors before and after. Frankly, we thought we had a reasonably good relationship with our farming neighbor, who was the grower in this case. And we thought we were doing pretty well with him until this event. And sadly, at this point in time, we have not had any contact with them since the spraying event. So it has been a year and a half since I've had a chance to say anything to them. It's possible that their lawyers have in fact instructed them not to speak with us. So, yeah, and we live in Tripoli, Iowa, and there's not very many people there. So if we run into each other, it's kind of difficult as far as that's concerned. Nonetheless, we forge on, and we try not to hold personal grudges about these things, because some of this was an accident, and some of this maybe wasn't an accident. It's kind of hard to tell at this point, but we have since learned how the system works for the farmer, and it makes it a little harder for the farmer to necessarily know what's going on. I noticed that Sam mentions the fact that buffers are non-functional when you can get drift from a mile or more away. Sam, you're entirely correct. One of the Pesticide Bureau folks told me he could go into the middle of one of the bigger forests in Iowa and find pesticide and herbicide residue because we live in the state of Iowa, and that's something that a lot of us do. We use a lot of pesticides and herbicides and fungicides in this state. All right, Drake is asking if we considered suing under trespass. We are not suing under trespass in part because right now legal precedent for that is, shall we say, difficult at best. There was the case in Minnesota where it went to the Supreme Court and was overturned. So it's not necessarily the best situation to try and go after. And to be perfectly frank, we would like to get this settled and try and move forward without these problems. So we'll see what happens. I don't necessarily want to become a poster child for this and then go through the entire process of appeals to the Supreme Court, et cetera, et cetera. We'd rather work more with the system in other ways. Sam's asking if we'll have a court date or if it'll be handled between attorneys. In general, our attorney has suggested that most of these cases are handled outside of court, that there typically will not be a court date. And it's just that typically the way these things work is they reach a certain deadline and then there's a flurry of activity and then something happens. So there could in fact be a court date set, but unlikely one will be kept is what I'm being told. At this point, we're just going to have to do what we're supposed to do and find out when it happens. All right, practices that have changed since this. That's a good question. I mean, some of the things that have changed are not necessarily a complete change. We're just more fervent about them, is maybe a way of putting it. One of the things that's particularly different is once we learned how the spraying situation works, we now send letters to all of the cooperatives in our area. Every single one of them, even though, and I believe that's 7 of them is what Tammy is telling me right now. So 7 different co-ops get notes from us. Whereas before we kind of targeted on the ones we thought we knew were the ones who sprayed the local, the surrounding fields. So we're more aggressive with letting these people know that we're there. We're also looking more at trying to grow up our bush lines and make them a little stronger. We threw up a lot more signs, and the fact that we do try to have people on the farm during spray periods is probably the biggest change because we want people to keep an eye on what's going on. So those are some of the biggest things. As far as what am I growing on the transition acres, Gene, that's a really good question. One of the things we planned on doing, now remember we're farmers on a small farm and you all know what the weather was like last year. So the plans we made changed because we're in a fairly heavy soil and we had all that rain early, so I had to move things around. But the plan was to grow crops that have lower value per acre and are less likely to take up any residuals. So for example, sweet corn and pumpkins, those kinds of things were pretty good candidates for the spray area. And so that was our plan. But then that was the only field early in the spring that ended up drying out enough for us to put things in. So we ended up putting other things in there. The high tunnel, sadly, is a different matter because you can't really, well, you do what you have to do with it because that's our only high tunnel. So we did everything we could to try to leach out any of the residuals. We cleaned out all the greens in the fall, and then we ran an overhead sprinkler on there for a very long time to get the water in there to help the chemicals to break down. And then we proceeded with a normal growing plan in the high tunnel. So that's kind of what we did with that. Really good question, Gene. Did we have to wash or move the high tunnel? Well, you can spray it down. And it is a movable high tunnel, but it's a movable high tunnel on tracks. So it's actually only got 2 positions, and both are in the spray zone. If we wanted to grow our high tunnel produce for certified organic, we would have had to physically have moved the whole thing to the eastern part of the farm. And that was not really feasible. Now, what I do need to make clear is that you can, in fact, grow things in these fields now. I mean, they are as safe as, you know, as most product is going to be. They're just not certified organic because these things, the chemicals have broken down by this point in time. But you cannot sell them as certified organic. We're being more cautious in that there are some types of produce that will take up residual chemicals faster or more than others. So we're trying to avoid growing those things in these areas. But I suspect if one were to test the soils and test the leaves of crops that were grown in there, they would be no worse than anything else on the farm. Because again, let's be honest about this. As Sam pointed out, if you can get a little bit of drift from 1 or 2 miles away, the likelihood that anybody in the state of Iowa has a completely clean crop, I'm not entirely sure what I can say about that. I don't know. Karen's asking about plants like cattails for bioremediation. That's a good question, and the answer to your question is we really didn't do anything with plants for bioremediation, other than the fact that we did some reseeding in the pastures to try and replenish certain crops, and we did some work with cover crops as well as in some of these areas. But there was no specific plan for that. It was more we're just trying to do everything we can and make it as healthy as we can within the realm of what we have available to us. The sad thing is we're 15 acres and we have a certain amount of resources. So sometimes you have to do things the way you can do them. Tammy asked a question or suggested I point out that one of the side effects of this is there is at least one outlet that we sell local produce at that we sell there because it was certified organic produce. So some of those sales are gone because a lot of that came from our high tunnel. And so that is missing. Sam is asking if we lost some CSA members because of this, and the answer to that is, well, of course we lost a couple. But for the most part, by keeping this clear to them what was going on, for the most part, people stayed, and then if anything, maybe I don't know. It's kind of hard to say why they stayed or why they didn't stay. But I can tell you there were a couple that it was critical that everything be certified organic. So if you can't say that about everything, then they're not going to stay. I see that there's another question here. Let me throw another thing out at you. There was another thing that we did do differently, or we're doing more differently after the spraying incident, and that's actually splitting crops into different farm locations. For example, we had all our peppers and eggplants in that field that got sprayed, so of course we had no peppers and eggplant to give to anybody. And what made it worse is the high tunnel had the rest of our peppers. So we had no peppers or eggplants. So one of the things we're doing is we will be adding a second high tunnel, and it will be on a different part of the farm. And we'll be splitting crops like peppers into 2 different fields. So if there is a drift on one side of the farm or the other, or a problem, hopefully we don't get hit on the whole farm, so the other half should still be okay. So we're actually diversifying location as well as types of crops. Drake is asking if we're seeking compensation for labor time in addition to crop loss. Essentially what we've been advised to do is to list everything that we are doing differently and give estimates as to what it took to do those things differently as a result of the spraying incident. So one of the things that is useful is to try and take notes as to what you're doing differently. Tammy and I have been more or less successful at this. It depends on the moment. I mean, you get busy and you don't always remember, and a week has gone by. But you still need to try and take notes about what was going on, what you did differently, how you reacted to things. For example, we had to move fencing around so we could move birds into new areas. Because if you've ever tried herding turkeys, it doesn't necessarily work real well sometimes. So what you do is you have to move fencing incrementally.
Okay, if there's no more questions out there, I want to thank Rob for a wonderful presentation. Thank everyone for their attention and sticking through the technical difficulties. Oh, one more question coming in.
I like that. That's a good question.
I agree. Great job. And the second internet connection was much better.
Yeah, well, we come prepared for such things, and we'll make it work one way or the other. I appreciate all the attention. Good questions. That's what makes presentations like this work. If there are other questions that you have for me that you don't want to ask here, you'll notice that my address is down there for email down at the bottom, and I'll do my best to help. Just remember that there might be some things I will choose not to answer, and there may be various reasons for that, but I'll do what I can to help.
Thanks again, everyone.